Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material on H.R. 4664, and that I may include tabular material on the same.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 847 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 4664. The Chair appoints the gentleman from New York, Mr. Williams, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 4664, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill making appropriations for financial services and general government for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2024, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their respective designees. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Womack, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I am pleased to begin consideration of H.R. 4664, the fiscal year 2024 Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Bill. Before I get into details, I'd like to recognize the hard work of Chairwoman Granger on this bill and the entire appropriations process. We are one step closer to passing the last remaining few appropriation bills. I also want to thank my good friend and ranking member, Steny Hoyer, for his input on this bill and the many conversations we've had. Steny is a dear, dear friend of mine, somebody that I work very closely with, not only with this bill, but on other matters of importance to our country. I consider him a very, very dear friend, and it's an honor to have him at my side as the ranking member, and I mean that, Steny, sincerely. And Mr. Chairman, I want you to look at these people right here. This is my team, and I know I'm a bit prejudiced. Steny would probably say the same thing about his team. These are the best that we have. Lauren Flynn and her team, my personal staff, the work that they have put into this process is truly remarkable. And I want the American people to know how dedicated these folks are in trying to deal with the challenges that face our country on an everyday basis. In this case, the funding of our government. I could not do what I do, nor could any member of this House of Representatives. No member can do what they do without the dedication of these people, and it's not lost on me, and I want to publicly recognize them. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 4664 provides $25.279 billion in non-defense discretionary spending across a number of critical agencies. The swath that we cover is incredible. It also includes $45 million in defense spending. It rejects over $6 billion in discretionary funding increases within the President's budget request. The bill represents an adequate level of funding given our fiscal constraints. It's 7% below the fiscal 23 enacted, 2% below the fiscal 22 enacted level. The bill provides the resources necessary to combat threats and protect the integrity of our financial and judicial system. We claw back over $10 billion of unused and unobligated Inflation Reduction Act IRS funding, preventing the creation of a super army of IRS agents poised to target individuals and small business owners. This rescission does not touch taxpayer services or the modernization of business systems, which means taxpayers will still be able to get the assistance they need to file their taxes, and IRS can continue to modernize their systems and better protect taxpayer data from cyber attacks. We also rescind IRA money from the General Services Administration targeted to make federal buildings greener. Instead of leading by example in the construction of sustainable buildings. GSA should lead by example by bringing their employees back to the office, like the private sector. I am proud this bill requires federal agencies to return to the office at pre-pandemic telework levels. We must hold the federal workforce accountable for the quality of their work and the service they provide to the American people. The administration has been unwilling to make any real progress on this front, and we cannot afford to have vacant federal buildings in the district and across our country. The bill demands that agencies concentrate on their core mission. Let me say that again. It's important that our agencies that we fund stick to their core mission. The pursuit of job-killing, burdensome, and unnecessary regulations only serves to further bloat a federal bureaucracy that has become, in my strong opinion, too big, too intrusive, and counterintuitive to limited government. Specifically, we turn off rulemakings at the Securities and Exchange Commission that lack proper cost-benefit analysis and aggregate impact analysis. Further, we prohibit agencies like the SEC and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from collecting and storing personal data that is unconstitutional and serves no regulatory purpose. To be clear, the agencies under our jurisdiction perform important functions. However, many have strayed from their purpose, and the results have been a true disservice to the American people. This bill responsibly returns them to their core mission. Mr. Chair, this bill is a strong bill with funding reductions and policy wins. I urge its adoption, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized. Sorry, gentleman from Maryland.
Well, either
perhaps
way,
one time
I'll
visited
stand
Illinois is recognized.
I thank the
you,
chair.
sir.
First of all, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, let me say that I echo the remarks of the chairman of this committee. The American public, I think, would be pleased and say, look, this is how it ought to work. Mr. Womack and I have great respect for one another, and we are great friends, and have been long before we were chair and ranking member on this subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee. He is a person of great integrity, great insight, and great work ethic. He is somebody that I think the House can be proud of, and somebody that I hold, as he said of me, a dear friend. I also want to echo his comments about the staff. The public doesn't see the staff for the most part, as frankly they don't see the majority, the overwhelming majority of federal employees who are not known to the general public. And there is a tendency, I think, to talk about the bureaucracy, and bureaucracy is used as a pejorative term, not as a descriptive term. And that's unfortunate, because the overwhelming majority of federal employees carry out their duties with great fidelity to their responsibilities and to the American people. So this bill, which is not the bill that, for the most part, most people focus on, but it is one of the most important bills that we consider, because all the other bills, all 11 other appropriation bills, are reliant on the collections made through this bill. And that's why I think it's so critical. Mr. Speaker, every member of this House ought to make it their goal to preserve America's fiscal health. Sharing that common goal, President Biden, Speaker McCarthy, and 149 Republicans and 165 Democrats, 314 people, 75% essentially of this House, agreed on a plan of going forward. And the first thing you do on a plan is decide how much are we going to spend. The President had a higher level. Some in this House and the Senate had a lower level. And Speaker McCarthy and President Biden came together and they agreed on a spending level. That is what we call, if we had done it through the regular order, a 302A allocation. In other words, what we're going to spend on the discretionary side of the ledger, which, by the way, is smaller than the mandatory side. We did that. We adopted that bill, as I said, with over 300 votes. And unfortunately, a week later, that agreement was broken by the Republican side of the aisle in saying, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to follow that agreement. We're going to fund at a much lesser level. Now, the problem with that is the Senate, Republican and Democratic members of the Senate, pursued under that agreement. And so they are literally billions of dollars different than we will be when these 12 bills, assuming we pass these 12 bills, and send them over to the Senate. And there's some in this House who have a theory that, well, that gives us the opportunity to negotiate from our numbers. The problem with negotiating from our numbers, nobody believes they're real. Well, that's not true. Some do. Some do. Some few in this body believe this is real, and they're going to somehow leverage these numbers and force the Senate and the President to do what they want them to do. The President of the United States and his administration have issued a veto threat on this bill if it were to be adopted. They're not going to have to exercise that veto because this bill is not going to be adopted. But I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, if Mr. Womack and I were left to our own devices, and he has a different perspective than I do, and that's what makes this body work, we would come to an agreement that I think, would pass the Senate and be signed by the President. Why? Because we would do what in a democracy you have to do, come together and compromise. Realizing full well that we have a Democratic President, we have a Democratic-controlled Senate, and we have a Republican almost majority. It's an absolute majority, I understand that politically, but it is not a majority that can always hold together, and therefore can't always affect the policies that it knows are reasonable and can be adopted. Now, I said at the beginning that we ought to preserve America's fiscal health. I believe that sincerely. The deal that we made, 67% of House Republicans voting for it, that bill that we have before us doesn't honor that agreement. As I said, it does not establish a foundation, really, for negotiation. It does nothing to avert the shutdown looming just a few days from today. And crucially, it will increase the deficit over time. I will explain why. In fact, this legislation severely undermines the government's ability to lower the deficit and to uphold the law of the land. It defunds crucial agencies that enforce laws, regulations, and rules established to protect the American people, American families, and America's children. Those cuts include the FTC, the SEC, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Election Assistance Commission, and the FCC, essentially saying to Americans, you're on your own. We're going to reduce oversight. This bill defends justice, if you will. It dramatically cuts funding for the Federal Public Defender Program, which helps ensure every American can exercise their constitutional right to an attorney. Other law enforcement agencies face dire cuts under this legislation. Among them, Mr. Speaker, are the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Now, we hear a lot about fentanyl. We hear a lot about money laundering. We hear a lot about the drug cartels making a lot of money. Well, we created the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, otherwise known as FinCEN, for the specific purpose of following the money. That's how Willie Sutton obviously got caught, tax evasion. Follow the money. And we've undermined that premise in this bill. We then decreased the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Terrorism, one of the great challenges of our time. And what do? We decrease the agencies that are charged with overseeing that, among other agencies. The Office of National Drug Control Policy. Now you would think, given the expression that all of us have and concern we have about fentanyl and drug abuse and drug deaths in this country, that we'd beef up that office to make sure that we can, in fact, confront this scourge on our people and our country. No, we cut it. And the emergency planning and security costs in this city, the capital city to which millions of our constituents come, reduced. In total, this bill cuts $345 million, or 6.2%, below the enacted for crucial law enforcement agencies. It provides $1.32 billion, or 20.2% less for law enforcement than what President Biden requested in his office. Mr. Speaker, in that context, I would ask, who is defunding the police? And yet Republicans have the nerve, frankly, not my chairman, but some Republicans have the nerve to accuse Democrats of trying to defund law enforcement. Paring back enforcement has dire consequences for the deficit as well, Mr. Speaker. This legislation is the latest salvo in some Republicans' long campaign to defund the Internal Revenue Service. The number of annual tax returns, Mr. Speaker, increased from 140.1 million in 1979 to 269 million in 2021. That's a 92% increase in workload. And so what is our response? Over the years, to reduce from 85,000 people in 1979 trying to handle this extraordinary workload to, in 2021, 78,661, an 8% decrease while a 92% workload increase occurred. That means refunds get delayed, returns aren't audited, owed taxes go uncollected, tax cheats and lawbreakers are not held accountable, and our debt grows even bigger. If you're a business trying to get the revenue you're owed, frankly, you don't fire the collection department. If you had bad debts, you go after them. This bill does just that, cuts the collection department. Contrary to Republican claims, this issue isn't about raising taxes on anyone. My friend, the Majority Leader, opined on this floor that these agents were going to raise people's taxes. Those agents can't raise anybody's taxes. The only people that could raise or lower taxes are the people who sit in this body and across the hall and the President of the United States. No agent can do that. All the agents can do is collect what is owing under the laws that we passed. Those agents that we each pay the share we legally owe enforce that, and they go after the cheats and lawbreakers who don't. If you're for law and order, that's what you're for. If people cheat, if people break the law, you hold them accountable. But if you're going to hold them accountable, you need the personnel to do so, because some of them have got scads of lawyers and accountants and very complicated returns of thousands of pages. Too often those lawbreakers are Americans with a lot of wealth and with complex tax filings. I'm not talking about the overwhelming majority of Americans who, by the way, taxes are withheld on a weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly basis. I'm talking about the select few who use pass-throughs, shell companies, offshore accounts to shield their vast wealth from taxation. I don't want them to pay any more than is owed, and I don't have any brief against anybody who is wealthy. What I have brief against is people who cheat and cheat their country. Maryland, Harvard, and Treasury experts found that there is 12-to-1 return on investment for IRS enforcement of the top 10% of earners. 12. Spend $1, you get 12 back. That's a pretty good deal, and it will make a real difference. Years of budget and staffing cuts have limited the IRS ability to conduct these company audits. Why? Because they're extraordinarily time-consuming and complex. Millionaires were 88% less likely to face an audit in fiscal year 2022 than they were in fiscal year 2010. A almost 100% reduction from essentially $9 plus to $1. The result is a backdoor tax cut, but only for those with the means and guile to exploit accounting trips to hide profits, income, and in the end, tax obligation. Their duty to support their country, their national security, the health care investments that we make in Medicare and Social Security. This bill includes 22.2% cut below the request for IRS enforcement. My chairman will correctly observe that the other items he will point out have been held relatively harmless. So it's only the collection department that was cut. And by the way, a recent article just last month pointed out that IRS now assumes estimates that there are $688 billion in unpaid taxes. Think of what that would do to the deficit over time. If you collected the money that was due, not that you're increasing, but that was due. That's a disservice to hardworking Americans who patriotically and conscientiously pay their taxes. This bill funds those agencies of government that keep us safe with a cut below the enacted of $9.6 million for the Office of National Drug Control Policy, which I talked about, $24.2 million for FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, follow the money, and $9.2 million to the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. Confront terrorism everywhere you find it. It disrupts the agencies that ensure the products we buy and the markets we invest in aren't overrun with fraud by undermining the independence of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And by cutting the Consumer Product Safety Commission. It's very hard for consumers, Mr. Speaker, to make a determination, is this product safe? Has it been tested? But they rely on us to make sure that, yes, it's been tested, and yes, it's safe, so it won't hurt or kill my children. And the SEC by $149 million, which disrupts the markets if people don't trust them. If you don't have an overseer, you didn't have an overseer in the 1920s. Now you have an overseer. And people have much more trust because of that overseer. It hampers the agencies that make those who try to get one over on the rest of us think twice and that hold these people accountable with a cut of $7 million to the FEC, $53 million to the Trade Commission, and $8 million to the Federal Communications Commission, which, by the way, in part is responsible for making sure we don't get all those junk calls all the time that annoy the living daylights out of all of us. These are just some of the cuts. If Republicans want to be the party of fiscal responsibility, if they want to be the party of law enforcement, they need to shelve this bill. They know this legislation will never become law. They've loaded it with partisan poison pills, which I have not spoken of, but I'm sure will be spoken of during the course of this, to undermine a woman's right to choose. I'm sure that everybody saw what happened in Ohio yesterday. Now, Ohio, for the most part, has been a red state. Overwhelmingly said a woman's right to choose needs to be protected. We believed in that so much that we're going to put it in our Constitution. This bill has been loaded with partisan poison pills designed to varnish American history. We don't want to talk about slavery. We don't want to make anybody feel badly about what their country did to people because of the color of their skin or their sexual orientation. Undermine diversity, equity, and inclusion, and exacerbate the climate crisis. Mr. Speaker, we'll talk about a lot of this bill for the next few hours, and I hope it's few hours, not more than that. I think the chair and I will try to achieve that objective. We ought to stop this nonsense. We're going to have a lot of amendments who reduce salaries to $1. That's not a serious Congress. It's not a serious Rules Committee who has amendment after, we're 55 amendments reducing salaries by $1, to $1, not by, to $1. that we're going to vote on. I don't know how many we'll vote on, but we've done 55 to date. The only ones that have been approved in a bipartisan voice vote. Every other one has been defeated, yet we keep dealing with these silly amendments while we undermine America's ability to collect the revenues it needs to protect the American people, play our role throughout the international community, and make America safer and a greater country and all it can be. I yield back. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Chairman, look, as I said earlier, Steny and I are really, really good friends. And this goes all the way back to when I first got here. He had already been here for a long time. I won't say how much time, but quite a while. And so I learned from people like that. And we just have a different view, in many cases, about sometimes the role of the government or why we need to fund the government at levels that they would prefer to have. And I'm just going to pick one issue. There are many we could talk about, but I want to talk. He mentioned fentanyl. And nobody in this country would argue that we don't have a fentanyl problem. 100,000 people a year dying as a result of this synthetic illegal substance that's making its way across our borders. What we believe, Mr. Chairman, what this side of the aisle believes is that instead of fighting the issue on the inside of the country, and oh, by the way, let me just remind you that on the high-intensity drug trafficking program, we fund HIDTA at a level higher than the President of the United States requested. It's a little bit less than last year, but higher than the President's request. So I reject out of hand the notion that we are endangering the lives of Americans because all of a sudden we don't think that fentanyl is a problem. No, we believe fentanyl is a problem, but we believe the problem should be addressed at the border of this country, at our southern border, where a lot of this product is making its way across without any effort, really, to stop it. And it's making its way into the households of America from sea to shining sea. And then all of a sudden, we get accused of wanting to cut budgets for agencies that target that illegal substance, that for some reason we're the bad guys. No, we think that if we had better border security, which is something that both sides of the aisle have argued about for decades, that if we had better border security, maybe we wouldn't need as much money to fight these problems interior to our country. So I use that as an example. And there are others, but let's just agree to this, that with the better part of a $2 trillion deficit this year, we have to address the root cause of what's causing such a difficult spot for this nation, and that is the fiscal health of the country. $2 trillion deficits, as far as the eye can see, are not a sustainable outcome. We're over $33 trillion in debt right now, and I guess the debt service of our country, I don't know what the current numbers are, but it's approaching $1 trillion a year. Think for just a moment what we could do if we were, instead of paying our creditors, we're able to use that $1 trillion for programs that benefit all Americans. But that's a subject for a different day. That, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield 3 minutes to my dear friend from the great state of Iowa, Ashley Henson, who's a very valued member of this subcommittee and a bright, shining star in the U.S. House of Representatives. I yield her 3 minutes.
The gentlewoman from Iowa is recognized for 3 minutes.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the gentleman from Arkansas for yielding me the time to speak on this very important piece of legislation today, and for your leadership, Mr. Chairman, on this bill. It is tough to craft a bill that funds the priorities of the American people in a way that is targeted and respects taxpayers, and I appreciate the approach that you have had to do that in a very meaningful way. It's why I'm supporting this bill here today, the fiscal year 24 Financial Services General Government Appropriations Bill. This bill does deliver on the promises that we have made to the American people. We are reining in out-of-control spending and regulation. We're restoring accountability for taxpayers, and we're de-weaponizing the federal government. Additionally, as the chairman mentioned, we are prioritizing national security against our foreign adversaries, both in dealing with the border and also dealing with adversaries like China. So this bill does promote a federal government that works for the American people. We're ensuring that bureaucrats who have frankly been abusing the COVID-19 telework policies and are still working from home actually go back to work, get back in the office like America is. They need to start putting in 100% effort for the taxpayers that pay their salary. I'm not sure how many of my colleagues here in the chamber, Mr. Speaker, are aware of the GAO report that came out over the summer, but it flagged that, on average, 17 of 24 federal agencies here in Washington, D.C. were only using, on average, about 25% of their office space. Taxpayers fund the bill here for these offices at $7 billion a year. So the lights were on, but really no one was home. So we need to make sure that, again, they are putting 100% effort in for the taxpayers that pay their salary. I'm sure all of our offices are getting the same calls mine are about reduction in government services, and we need to make sure that they are giving 100%. This bill also restores accountability by reining in rogue, overreaching agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that will now be subject to congressional oversight, and it will answer to the American taxpayer rather than being able to pursue a partisan agenda that hurts our small businesses. This bill also protects American families and small businesses by rescinding funding for President Biden's proposals to supercharge an army of IRS agents while maintaining, again, those very important taxpayer service operations. We don't want to see, again, like I said, a reduction in services for our taxpayers, and when they're calling, they should not be getting a dial tone. Our bill also protects Iowa farmers from onerous regulations like the SEC's climate disclosure rule and the expansive Scope 3 emissions disclosure requirement. This would be disastrous for producers, not only in my district but around the country. It would bury our hardworking farmers who feed and fuel the world in paperwork and compliance costs. We're also taking steps, strong steps to ensure that we are bolstering national security against threats from our adversaries, like the Chinese Communist Party. I also serve on the Select Committee on Strategic Competition with China, and I think this is of utmost importance, Mr. Speaker. We need to protect taxpayer resources from supporting the Wuhan Institute of Virology or any other laboratory operated by the CCP. And finally, this includes my language to require the GSA to investigate the status of Chinese surveillance equipment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I may have another 30 seconds to wrap.
I'd like to give the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
The gentlewoman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this finally includes my initiative to require the GSA to investigate the status of Chinese surveillance equipment on federal property. It supports efforts to remove that telecom equipment from U.S. networks. So I think this really hits the mark in investing in the priorities I continue to hear about from my constituents, Mr. Speaker. It's why I'm proud to support it, and I thank the chairman for yielding. I yield back the balance of my time.
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 6 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, former Chair Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut.
The gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized for 6 minutes.
Thank the gentleman, and thank you, Chairman Womack, Ranking Member Hoyer, and the subcommittee staff, especially Matt Smith, Philip Tizzani, for all the work that you do. This financial services and general government bill put forth by the majority is unacceptable. The Republicans propose cutting critical agencies the American people depend on for a stable, secure, safe, and fair economy by a staggering 58%. My colleagues across the aisle often claim to support things like law and order, economic competition, protecting children, yet their actions demonstrated by this bill suggest otherwise. Cuts to the Small Business Administration would cut off assistance and resources that help small business start, grow, compete. Cuts to the Securities and Exchange Commission would benefit market manipulators and inside traders over families saving for retirement. Cuts to the Federal Trade Commission would levy higher prices on Americans and make seniors more prone to be victimized by scammers. And cuts to the Consumer Product Safety Commission would enable dangerous products to hit store shelves and enter our homes, potentially harming our children. And finally, cuts to the Internal Revenue Service would protect cheats over honest, hard-working families. We know an underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed IRS means the wealthiest billionaires and corporations often avoid paying taxes. Not often, they avoid paying taxes. According to Secretary Yellen, and I quote, in 2019, the top 1% of Americans was estimated to owe over 1/5 of unpaid taxes, leaving ordinary Americans to shoulder the burden, end quote. Furthermore, in 2021, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy found at least 55 of the largest corporations in America in a year they saw over $40 billion in pre-tax income had paid no federal corporate income taxes. Corporations like Nike, Hewlett-Packard, and Dish Network paid zero federal income taxes. Treasury recently announced that thanks to the resources provided in the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRS is pursuing back taxes owed from about 1,600 taxpayers with incomes over $1 million. They have so far closed 100 of those cases, collecting $122 million since September. That is not a tax increase. That is collecting revenue legally owed. You know, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle framed the debt as the problem of our investments, our public investments in the American people. We have a revenue problem, and they refuse to let the IRS collect legally owed taxes from their billionaire and corporate friends to address this problem. Earlier this year, disadvantaging small businesses, making seniors susceptible to scammers, exposing children to dangerous products, rigging the stock market for well-connected and the wealthiest. We cannot stand for this. Earlier this year, I met with the SBA Administrator Guzman. Small Business Administrator is extraordinarily concerned with how they will provide the resources America's entrepreneurs rely on to help their business start and grow if these cuts are enacted. Small businesses are an essential part of the American economy and really are the core of financial security to our middle class. They define Main Street in neighborhoods across the country. This bill not only slashes funding for the IRS by $1 billion, takes back more than $10 billion in funding provided in the Inflation Reduction Act. This is on top of cuts to the IRS that the majority is pursuing as a condition for providing aid to Israel. And in addition to the $57 billion in cuts to the IRS's Inflation Reduction Act, funding in the other 11 appropriations bills. These cuts would rob the Treasury of $130 billion and hand it directly to billionaires, the biggest corporations, fraudsters, and tax cheats. That's not according to me. That is according to the Congressional Budget Office. I've heard my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk about wanting to be tough on China, and yet this bill includes no funding for the administration's efforts to restrict outbound investment in countries like China that threaten our national security. The majority is giving a green light to the potential offshoring of critical United States supply chains to foreign adversaries like China and Russia. And of course, the majority doesn't stop there. Dozens of problematic, pointless riders, including prohibitions on the SEC's climate disclosure rule, prohibitions on health care and abortion, micromanaging the District of Columbia's traffic laws at the level that is petty and deserves derision. The Financial Services and General Government Bill is central to effectively running the federal government, providing services to the American people. The majority's bill instead focuses on protecting the tax dollars and the priorities of billionaires and big corporations. For all these reasons, I cannot support this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Reserve.
I yield 3 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida, a member of the Appropriations Committee, Ms. Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
The lady from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to recognize my dear friends, Chairman Womack and Ranking Member Hoyer, and I do mean that in the truest sense of the word, for their work on this bill, which does contain several of my priorities. And I do want to respond quickly to the Chairman's comments about the border really being the problem with fentanyl coming across into the United States, and that it's not necessary to fund the Office of Drug Control. When you focus on safety, making sure that you can keep people safe from harm that they can't avoid on their own, we need layers of protection. And so it is a fool's errand to cut an office like the Office of Drug Control Policy because we aren't doing enough, in your mind, to handle drug entries into the country from the border. It's both and when it comes to safety, not either or. And unfortunately, this bill, although it does contain several of my priorities, has so many misguided, toxic, and extreme provisions that it'll make us all less safe and careens our government once again toward a shutdown. This is a bill that is rather unsung. I always try to come and talk about this bill. It does have a whole lot of acronym agencies that have far reach into Americans' protection, security, safety, and it's so important that we make sure we shine a little bit of a spotlight on it as a result. And this bill does prioritize reducing pool and spa deaths by providing $2.5 million for programs authorized under my Virginia Graham Baker Pool and Spa Safety Act, for which I appreciate the Chairman's help. As the leading cause of unintentional death for children under 5 in the United States, drowning is clearly a public health threat that we must confront. But sadly, overall, this bill makes all of our constituents less safe. This bill handcuffs consumer watchdogs, leaving hardworking families more vulnerable to fraud or dangerous, deadly products. It guts the Consumer Product Safety Commission's already paltry budget, slashing resources at an agency that has a major focus on protecting children and families. We need to keep families safe, not make them nervous to choose products when they walk down the aisles of a store. On top of protecting scammers and cheats, this bill hurts public servants and threatens our national security. How does it do that? The same Republicans who claim to support our national defense and armed forces would cut the National Security Council in this bill and the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. The same Republicans boast how tough they are on heroin and fentanyl actually cut the Office of National Drug Control Policy in this bill. Don't believe Republicans who claim to be the party of law and order either. This bill actually underfunds multiple levels of our federal courts and the public defenders. This bill basically waves white-collar criminals right on through to do their sketchy business by cutting the SEC and the FTC. If you want to empower scammers and cheats or get more robocallers bothering you at home by ringing your phone off the hook, vote for this bill. But if you want to protect families, vote against it. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maryland Reserve. And from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At this time, Mr. Chair, I'd like to recognize the Wildcat from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, for the purpose of engaging in a colloquy.
Well, I want to thank Mr. Womack, Chairman of the Financial Services and General Government Subcommittee, not only for his leadership, but his rabid support of the Razorbacks. We have a big rivalry, Kentucky and Arkansas in basketball, but in this case, we are on the same page, Mr. Speaker, because the Chairman has rightly included in this year's FSGG Appropriations Bill my legislation, H.R. 1382, the Taking Account of Bureaucrats Spending Act, or the TABS Act, which would separate the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from the Federal Reserve System, make it an independent agency, and subject it, importantly, to the congressional appropriations process. The TABS Act would remedy the serious constitutional defect in the structure of the CFPB as established by the Dodd-Frank Act, under which the CFPB draws its funding uniquely from the Federal Reserve instead of from Congress, like most other executive branch agencies. Specifically, Dodd-Frank delegates to the director of the CFPB the unilateral power to decide in perpetuity how much money he wants for the agency to carry out its broad and potent regulatory and enforcement powers. The director then requests such amount from the Fed, which is itself exempt from the congressional appropriations process, making it double insulated from accountability. And then the Fed is then required to provide such amount to the agency, no questions asked. This is a constitutional aberration, and it is a violation of the separation of powers. Although the total amount the director can request is capped in the law, the cap is so high that it effectively grants the CFPB director unfettered discretion over the agency's amount of funding and how it is spent. No other federal agency in the entire federal bureaucracy is funded in this manner. Indeed, there is no analog for the CFPB anywhere in the history of the U.S. executive branch. Even among self-funded agencies, the Bureau is unique. It is a perpetual, self-directed, double-insulated funding structure that goes a significant step further than that enjoyed by any other agency, again, in the history of our republic. The TABS Act would fix this, and it would bring much-needed accountability to the CFPB and uphold the Constitution's separation of powers and the exclusive grant of the appropriations power to Congress. I want to make a couple of points about the TABS Act. First, the purpose of this bill is not to repeal or undermine consumer protection laws. Rather, the purpose is to address the constitutional defect in the CFPB's funding structure. No one is objecting to the utility of some federal consumer protections, but we should also agree that the Constitution reserves to Congress the sole authority to set funding limits for the CFPB and other executive branch agencies. I note that the FY24 FSGG bill would fund the CFPB at near current levels. I would also note that H.R. 2798, the CFPB Transparency and Accountability Reform Act, which was marked up out of the Financial Services Committee on April 26th, included this bill, the TABS Act, and authorized to be appropriated from unobligated amounts contained in the Consumer Financial Civil Penalty Fund, $650 million for FY24. Again, at levels comparable to what the CFPB received from the Fed this year. So, to my friends on the other side of the aisle, you can't make the argument that we're trying to defund the agency, that we're trying to gut consumer protection laws, because we're manifestly proving we're not doing that. We're funding the agency the way it should be. This clearly demonstrates that the TABS Act is not about eliminating consumer protections or the CFPB, but it's about upholding the Constitution. It's about defending the Congress, this institution. If this bill is enacted into law, the agency would continue to operate. The only difference would be that the Congress would oversee the agency's spending in the same way it does for all other consumer protection agencies and most of the rest of the federal government. As you know, the Supreme Court recently heard the case of Community Financial Services Association of America versus CFPB, in which the agency's funding structure was challenged as violating the Constitution's separation of powers and the Appropriations Clause, which provides that, quote, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. If the Supreme Court strikes down the CFPB's funding structure, as it should in this case, this bill will ensure that the agency continues to operate. Following such a decision by the court, chaos would not ensue, as some have suggested, nor would there be great uncertainty in the marketplace about the status of consumer protection laws and regulations. On the contrary, this legislation demonstrates that Congress is prepared to assert its appropriations power to stabilize pre-existing consumer protection laws and make sure that the CFPB is funded with better and more meaningful oversight in the event that the Supreme Court strikes down the funding mechanism. The Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that the legislative branch, the people's elected representatives in Congress, make the key decisions about our government, especially how tax dollars are spent. As Madison wrote in Federalist Paper number 58, the power of the purse may in fact be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure. This is a sound principle which in the context of the CFPB or any other executive branch agency, every member of Congress, Republican and Democrat, should defend. This is not a partisan issue. This is about defending this institution and our power of the purse. And I ask my friends on the other side of the aisle, if Congress passed legislation funding the Department of Defense or the CIA in the same manner as the CFPB is currently funded, would that be acceptable? Would we want those agencies to be completely unaccountable to our oversight? The appropriations process is the primary means by which Congress on a bipartisan basis oversees those agencies, as well as all consumer protection agencies. Now, some will say that Congress can change the CFPB's funding structure at any time, so there's really no problem with the structure. Well, this is ridiculous. This is absurd. Our Constitution does not permit elected representatives in Congress to delegate away our authority, which is textually reserved to the Congress, to some other branch of government or an executive branch official. It requires that the key decisions remain in the hands of the elected representatives of the people. Congress cannot delegate away its responsibilities without undermining the separation of powers, even if it could pass legislation to retake such responsibilities in the future. Instead, it is the Supreme Court's duty to strike down laws that violate the Constitution, even if Congress could remedy those violations. For example, the Supreme Court strikes down laws that violate the First Amendment or the Commerce Clause, even though Congress could remedy those violations. There is no reason why the same should not be true of laws that violate the Appropriations Clause. Moreover, in Celia law, the court struck down the infringement of the president's removal power over the director of the CFPB. I hope now it protects Congress's power as it did the president's power in Celia law. After all, the Supreme Court's role is not just to prevent the erosion of presidential powers, but also Congress's powers. The reason the CFPB's funding structure is so problematic is that when Congress delegates its core responsibilities away to administrative agencies, the value of each American's vote is diminished. As Congress has delegated more responsibilities and more authorities to administrative agencies, Americans have come to increasingly believe that their votes do not matter. They see that changes in Congress don't change policies set by agencies. Lack of congressional control over the CFPB creates the opportunity for special interests to capture the CFPB, who run the agency according to their own ideological vision, not according to the will of the American people. Changing the CFPB's funding structure would be an important and common sense step in restoring faith in our democracy. It's important to recognize that the structure of the CFPB is an aberration in our government. No other agency is funded by the Federal Reserve at the level set by the director of the other agency. Now, I know a lot of people have raised concerns that striking down the funding structure of the Bureau would open up the question of constitutionality of the Federal Reserve and a few other agencies that are funded through assessments or other funding streams that they incur in their operations. But the funding structure of the CFPB is unique. Unlike other agencies that may be funded by a specific source of funding that they raise in the course of their operations, seniorage in the case of the Federal Reserve, fees on banks in the case of the Comptroller of the Currency, deposit insurance premiums in the case of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, tariff revenue in the case of the Customs Service. The CFPB is different. There's no analog. It determines its own funding by taking funds from the Federal Reserve. No other agency obtains its funding by taking funds in this way. Further, there is no nexus between its statutory responsibilities, consumer protection, and its funding source, the Federal Reserve. In conclusion, while there has been much debate about where to draw the constitutional line on how agencies can be funded consistent with the Appropriations Clause, the funding structure of the CFPB is one we should all agree goes too far. As with the Supreme Court determination in the Free Enterprise Fund case that double insulation on removal was too far with respect to limits on the presidential removal authority, the same should apply here. The funding structure of the CFPB goes too far without having to answer or raise questions about other agencies. Granting federal agencies the authority to derive their funding from the Federal Reserve outside of the appropriations process is a dangerous precedent and is fundamentally inconsistent with the Constitution's separation of powers. The Federal Reserve seniorage from money creation is not a piggy bank Forcing the Federal Reserve to pay for other government operations risks compromising the Fed's monetary policy independence. And for these reasons, I urge the Supreme Court of the United States to do the right thing, to vindicate the separation of powers, to uphold Congress's appropriations authority over federal executive branch agencies. And I urge my colleagues to remedy this constitutional defect, pass the Womack Appropriations Bill, pass the TABS Act, and restore congressional appropriations authority. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Barr, for your kind remarks and for your hard work in drafting the TABS Act. We are pleased to include it in this year's Financial Services General Government Appropriations Bill. Let me add that I fully agree with your assessment of the importance of making the CFPB part of the annual appropriations process. As you noted, most agencies are funded by Congress, including all the traditional consumer protection agencies, as you have articulated. I also agree with you that the purpose of this legislation is to uphold the Constitution. I mean, that is our oath. That's what we swear to on January 3rd every other year. This is a principled action. It is not an effort to kill the CFPB. That's why this bill funds the CFPB at the level it receives now. We merely want to create an accountable funding structure for the CFPB that is like all other consumer protection agencies. That's why I will not support the amendment to eliminate the funding. That's why constitutional principles, this is about the constitutional principles, not the CFPB's existence. Finally, let me say the Appropriations Committee has a critical constitutional responsibility to oversee how the federal government spends taxpayer dollars. The annual process is the mechanism whereby our democracy ensures that the people's priorities are reflected in how taxpayer dollars are allocated and spent. It's my hope the Supreme Court recognizes this fact and strikes down the funding structure of the CFPB. And with that, Mr. Chairman, we reserve our time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, let me say I'm sympathetic to the issue of the Appropriations Committee needs to conduct oversight. But I will tell everybody in this chamber and those who are watching, this matter was a subject of very serious debate and resolution. And the resolution was we wanted to keep this agency independent and free of any political pressure. It was adopted on that basis by the House and the Senate and signed by the President of the United States. It is now the subject of a Supreme Court hearing. This is authorizing in the extreme on appropriation bill, which, but for the waiver that was issued by the Rules Committee, would be a point of order, would be applicable, and would not be considered. And I suggest that this is an authorizing matter. It is a matter that the Financial Services Committee needs to be seized of and report the gentleman's legislation out to the floor, and that ought to be considered in the regular order. This is not the regular order for a major authorizing change, which was very controversial at the time it was raised, and it was passed to make sure that consumers are, in fact, protected and insulated from political pressure. And therefore, at such time, I will support an amendment to take this from the bill. And now I yield 1 minute to my friend from California, Mr. Levin.
I thank the ranking member for yielding. Mr. Speaker,
I rise today to address. For 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address our country's urgent need for a Supreme Court code of ethics. Over the past year, we've seen troubling reports of justices receiving lavish gifts from political donors with connections to cases before the Supreme Court and who stand to benefit from rulings. This is unacceptable and unethical, and it has undermined public trust in the institution. It's time for the Supreme Court to adopt and abide by a judicial code of ethics. Currently, all federal judges must abide by a code of ethics, except for Supreme Court justices. That must change. I introduced an amendment to the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Bill that would withhold $10 million in funding from the Supreme Court until the justices adopt a code of ethics. This amendment, which I introduced with Congressman Hank Johnson, would have restored public confidence in this institution. It would have helped us solve one of the many problems our voters sent us to Washington, D.C. to fix: the corrupt power of money in politics and our judicial system. Sadly, Republicans on the Rules Committee would not even consider my amendment in order. We must do better, and I yield back.
Reserve the balance.
The gentleman from Maryland reserves. The gentleman from Arkansas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield 30 seconds to I'm going to give a minute to the gentleman because I know he's from Kentucky. He can't say what he needs to say in 30 seconds, so I'm going to give him a full minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief in response to my friend, the gentleman from Maryland, who makes the argument that the authors of the Dodd-Frank law made, which was that we designed this to be independent. Well, that's fine. That's what they wanted, but they can't do it unconstitutionally. And as the Fifth Circuit said very, very well, while the defenders of the structure of the agency, of the CFPB, contend that there's no constitutional infirmity because the funding scheme was actually enacted by Congress in the Dodd-Frank law, and therefore it's constitutional. In essence, the Bureau contends that because Congress spun the agency's funding mechanism into motion when it passed the act, voila, the Appropriations Clause is satisfied. That's not the way the Constitution works, Mr. Speaker. This body cannot unconstitutionally delegate away our most fundamental power, which is the power of the purse. Vote for the Womack Appropriations Bill, restore the power of the purse, defend this institution.
Time has expired.
I yield.
Thank you. We reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
May I ask the chair if he has any more speakers?
No, we are prepared to close.
Okay. I'm prepared to close. Mr. Speaker, number one, on this issue, it is pending before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can decide whether it is constitutional or not. We can't decide whether something's constitutional or not. Ultimately, the Supreme Court decides that. We pass laws, and we certainly hope and expect them to be constitutional. So I would, again, reiterate my opposition to the gentleman's amendment on this bill. Mr. Speaker, in closing, let me say this bill underfunds the most important aspect of the federal government, and that is collecting the revenues to run it in a balanced way. It undermines that effort. I urge opposition to the bill.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say, as I started in the opening, great respect for my friend, Mr. Hoyer from Maryland, and his team over there. They do their work in accordance with what they feel are the emerging issues facing our country. We do the same on our side. Suffice it to say, though, what we need right now is we need a bill across this floor that we can use as a basis to go negotiate with our Senate counterparts at the other end of this Capitol and hopefully come up with a conference report that we can all live with. We know that the clock is running. America knows that on November 17th, we're going to have a continuing resolution of some form to be able to continue the work of this appropriations process. And a lot of work has gone into it. We can have our differences. Those are well stated, as evidenced by the debate this morning. But we need to finish our work, get this. We'll have a big amendment process going on throughout the day, today and tonight, and into tomorrow. But we need right now to finish our work on this bill, get it across the finish line, make it a basis for negotiation in the Senate, get a conference report, and finish at least this portion of the 12 bill appropriations work. And that's what we're responsible in doing here today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back.